Afternoon. It is March the 9th, 2023. We are on the way to a quarter of the way through 2023. I don't know quite how that happened. I'm Matthew Holt, the founder and publisher of the Healthcare blog. This is THCB Gang. Great lineup today. Some of my favorites, and some of them we've now had on for for whatever reason, we've had some people on for sort of multiple weeks in a row, which is great. So we can try not to repeat what we did last week anyway. But I have Kim Bellard, writer and THCB contributor, John of Neptune, my former colleague and now these days CEO of Suntra Modern Recovery, Jen Benz from Siegel Benz, who got a plug from one of her channel partners in the week to me the other day. And our special guest this week is our friend Steven Wardell, from Wardell Advisors. Steven has been in the healthcare, digital health world for quite a bit, talking about money and how to get it and who has it and how to do this. So look forward to this chat. All right, everyone. Nice to see all of you. I hope those of you actually, only Jen and me are in California, so only two of us are going to be drowning. I'm intending to drive us to Tahoe tonight, which may or may not make it. We'll see how it goes. The last 2 weeks I was supposed to go up there, the roads have just been completely closed. So the California record winter continues on. Anyway, that's of no interest to anybody who lives, even vaguely east of the Rockies. So there we go. All right, let's start off and figure out what have people been up to, what have they been watching, what exciting stories in the world of health and health technology we heard of. So, Jen, why not start with you? Put you on the spot.
Well, the thing I've been following the most this week is the Walgreens news about not wanting to distribute the abortion pill, even in states that it's legal, even in states that have had constitutional ballot measures, stating that the constituents want it to be legal. So that's just fascinating. And of course, Governor Newsom in California pulled a deal from Walgreens right away. So it's just another kind of political legal battle to keep an eye on, but I think it has really significant implications. And my mind immediately, of course, went to birth control pills as well. So just, tons to unpack there.
Yeah, and we'll probably get JL's medical opinion on this, but I remember earlier in the sort of post-Dobbs sequence, one of those abortion pills gets used for something else that's not related to abortion, but is another medical condition, and people couldn't get it for whatever that condition was in some of those, what do you call it? Pro anti-abortion states, I guess. Anyway, Kim.
Well, I was also struck by the Walgreens thing, and my wife was asking me, should we switch our stuff from Walgreens? I said, I don't think the shoes are done dropping. I'm waiting to see what CVS and Rite Aid and other people do, Kroger's and so on, because I think the threat of being sued by all these attorney generals is going to outweigh the political correctness or the women's rights issues that they might otherwise be attending to. I do wonder if this is going to lead to more people taking advantage of some of the overseas options that have been out there, and part of me kind of hopes that they do, because people in the States have to start realizing that this is not, healthcare is no longer just a local thing, that there are people in other places that can do things. And sending prescriptions for abortion pills is one of those things that they can and are already doing. So at some point, we got to break down the borders, and this may, as painful as it's going to be, this may help push us more in that direction.
Right. JL, talking about not being able to prescribe certain drugs, your particular business has been in the middle of this in the last couple of weeks, and I wrote a piece about this on the THCB in the newsletter about the DEA and what they're up to, and there were some statements by the HHS secretary this week saying, well, it's kind of okay. I'm not opposed to what they're saying. So I don't know if that's what you're thinking of, or you're thinking some other stuff, but
well, I talked about the DEA stuff last week, and again, I continue to think it's an evolving situation. We're in a comment period here. It's a political process, and I think we'll see what comes out of it, right? I mean, it's sausage making, and we'll see what the final recommendations and rules are. But again, I think, we need to recognize that we're in the midst of a public health emergency, this one around the opioid epidemic, and we haven't, it's only gotten worse, and we need to do something about it. So that's my comment there. In terms of what I thought was interesting, there was a Pew Research Center study that was published that said that 60% of Americans would not feel comfortable with doctors using AI in the course of their treatment. And I thought that was very interesting, because I thought that in a very short period of time, like in a decade, it'll be flipped, where the vast majority of people will say, what is the computer saying? What is the computer recommending? I don't really trust you, human being. I think that's number one. And then number two, I don't think most people really realize how often when they go to see the doctor, when the doctor disappears, he's like flipping open a book and like looking up the dosage, or he's looking up, he or she is looking up some other thing that they don't necessarily have loaded up into their RAM. So I think people are going to start to understand like how much doctors already use computers, already rely on information systems to make decisions and to provide recommendations. And again, I think that 60% is going to flip in a very short period of time.
Yeah, it's like the driverless car thing, which seems to be taking forever to get finally done. But you can now take a driverless taxi in, I think, Phoenix and San Francisco and a bunch of cities in China. And you're seeing all these videos online of people with their self-driving Teslas, which keep on crashing in the middle of the road or randomly braking or whatever. But you can, we're at that sort of toddler stage in this artificial intelligence thing generally, and it's obviously, by definition, gonna grow. And those of us who've been using ChatGPT can see it advancing so quickly. So Steven, welcome to the show. Tell us what you've been up to lately and what you're doing with your time these days, and then join and tell us what you've been noticing recently. I should point out that I will be on your show next week, and you can tell us what that's about as well.
That's right. So next week we're talking about who are the consolidators, and in the world of young company leaders in digital health, they're all thinking right now about sort of who are the consolidators, with track record, who are motivated, that sort of thing. Jean-Luc, I recall way back, this must be 2005, I was engaged and I took my fiance to New Zealand, and she was feeling a mysterious pain, and we went to a hospital in the Queenstown area of New Zealand. And this was on a weekend, and a doctor showed up, and this doctor looked like he was like 24 or something. And he
in Brazil had been practicing for about 5 years by then.
And he came in and talked to us, and then he suddenly walked out, and we were in this partial room that had a curtain over the front of it. He walked out, and then he came back, talked to us a little more, and this was on the weekend in Queenstown, not a high population area, not a lot of doctors available at all on the weekend, and not a lot of staff in the hospital. And then he walked out, and then he came back and talked to us a little more, and then he walked out. And by this time, I'm wondering, why did he walk out? And so I peeked past the curtain, and he had walked up, this was unusual at the time, walked up to a computer and was reading the screen of a computer, and it was the New Zealand equivalent of UpToDate, basically. He was,
Sure.
These days I consult typically to young company CEOs. Also, I help with venture capital funds as well, but mainly young company CEOs on issues about thinking about, with all the options that they have and also the constraints they have, future product strategy in the lead up to a fundraise, where they have to make difficult decisions about what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize, and that then helps determine their story and their fundraising needs, which then also determines which investors they would go to. And so getting the alignment in those various steps. And I also have started a podcast about the investor side of the story called Digital Health Investor Talk. And that's the show and podcast that Matthew will be on next week.
We can only hope the quality of guests will improve dramatically in the near future after next week, for sure. Excellent. So thanks, Steve. That's great to have you back on THCB Gang. Look forward to being on with you next week. I think we'll dive into that in a bit, because today the news right now while we're talking is that Silicon Valley Bank, which is the bank for early stage startups, is off 50% and is in real trouble, and there might be a run on the bank and all this kind of stuff, and that's apparently as a consequence of some dubious investment decisions. They bought a bunch of stuff that went down, bonds that went down as interest rates went up, and also because they're not getting. They were usually expecting huge deposits from all those $100 million rounds, and they're not getting them anymore because there aren't so many of those $100 million rounds, and $100 million that was put in the bank has now been taken out, and there's a run in the bank. I don't know. It could be like the scene in It's a Wonderful Life where everyone stops in the rain and Mary Bailey has to wave her $2,000 to save the building alone. We'll see. But let's go back to the Walgreens issue, because I think Kim, you and Jen both had really interesting points to make about that. I am, recalling that when the Dobbs thing first happened, Deborah McGraw was on THCB Gang, and she obviously knows a lot about the law around data privacy. And she said, you do understand there is an exemption within HIPAA for legal requirements. So if a law enforcement agency comes and asks for data from a hospital or whomever, right, they can get it. And if the law in that state says that abortion is illegal and a doctor or whatever has been performing abortion, there's no something that says in HIPAA that the hospital can't tell is allowed to not tell the law enforcement agency that. And this is pretty worrying. And I would put the Walgreens original decision kind of in that bucket, right? I mean, are they, as you said, Kim, they're liable to get have a bunch of attorneys general from those states come after them. And you're also seeing in recent weeks, I've heard about, I think this is in Texas, where there's a state law has now been proposed to stop
Florida
or Texas to force attorneys generals who said they will not prosecute doctors or women seeking abortion in their city or their county or whatever, to say that they can no longer exercise their own discretion about who they prosecute. I mean, this whole thing seems to me that we've uncovered this massive barrel of worms. It's going to get worse and worse.
Well, and there's the whole federal case now that's before the judge in Texas that is basically saying the states want to override FDA. They want to be able to say to the FDA what drugs are permissible or not. And again, the state legislatures are getting way past themselves about what the role of the legislature is versus the practice of medicine, and it's a scary thing.
And can I jump in there? Because I was literally just typing that comment right now. I mean, now you're talking about legislatures who are not physicians, who are writing laws that impact what medicine and what medicines can be prescribed, what procedures can be done. Remember, in many of the states that are passing these anti-drag laws, they're often writing into the law that prohibitions against gender reassignment, which is part of a normal practice of medicine. Like, what's the next thing that's going to get banned or legislated? Are we going to start legislating bariatric surgery? Like, or are we not allowed to operate on overweight people because they're bad people and they're low morals? That's why they're heavy. I mean, it's frightening to think that we're moving in this direction of people at the state level trying to legislate what passes for medicine in their state.
Well, and especially when a lot of those decisions are being made for divisive political reasons. They have no grounding in medicine. They have no grounding in what's best for the state, what's best for the women or men there. There's no, what's best for the economy, none of that. And so it really does feel like the whim of these politicians, and they're using it a lot for the clickbait and for getting reelected, but it has really, really significant implications.
Well, there was a news article this morning about there's a case in Texas now that several women who have been harmed by the restrictions on their care because of the Texas laws and the consequences that has posed them, not relating to abortion. They weren't wanting to get abortions. These were people that couldn't get other care that they needed because of the restrictions that they put in generally. So this stuff has real consequences for people, not just the people you're trying to stop, but for other people. And the question, do the legislatures care at all? I mean, I'm afraid they don't.
There are tons of stories. Sorry, Kim, on that point, there are tons of stories of women who have been refused prenatal care before the deadline in that state to get an abortion, refused prenatal care altogether, not even trying to seek an abortion, but the clinics are turning them away, saying, we don't even want to see you until it's past the abortion deadline, which that is just absurd. And what kind of long-term implications is that creating?
There's one woman, I believe, that her fetus was not viable, but they waited till she turned septic before they would allow the abortion to be done. So they put her life at real danger. The other thing that was in articles today was, so this is not unusual for Walgreens. Walgreens for many years has allowed their pharmacists to decide what things they would or would not give to people. If they didn't feel comfortable giving people birth control, they could say no. So
meanwhile, Walgreens allowed thousands and thousands of opioids to be distributed in San Francisco knowing full well that the doctors who were writing those prescriptions were on watch lists, that, they had people reporting, like the pharmacist reporting, this person's coming in to fill this prescription, and I see them immediately selling the pills outside. They let that go on for years. So it's just, it's absurd for that, it's absurd.
While we're ragging on Walgreens, and there's somebody who stupidly bought their stock when Amazon bought PillPack and saw it go up and then forgot to sell. The other thing that they did, which CVS, or they did not follow CVS in, was that CVS stopped selling tobacco products, right? Stopped selling cigarettes, because it said we're now a healthcare organization. And Walgreens said Walgreens statement, I think at the time, was we're on the corner of happy and healthy, and sometimes these things just make people happy, right? And so it's interesting how that plays out. But I mean, they are now a healthcare organization, right? They're not just a pharmacy. They're also bought Village MD. Village MD has been buying a bunch of other practices recently. They bought Summit in New Jersey and City MD in New York, and I think they bought something else again. We said Village MD.
They have a PBM.
Yeah, and of course the PBM. So they are clearly. I mean, they don't have a health plan attached like CVS does, but they're clearly, moving into the big. They're not as big a company or successful as CVS, but they're moving into that zone. The way that Optum is and others, they're kind of on the provider side. So I think it's interesting but it is, this sort of messy situation is going to continue on for a long time, because there's now we have Republican House. There's no chance of an easy resolution with it there. And obviously, who knows what happens when he gets to the Supreme Court, right? Which, after all, caused this in the first place by the passage of Dobbs. So I don't know. Kim, is the thing in front of the judge in Texas about the abortifacient pill, is that going to rule just for those states or for all states? Or for
all states? All states. I'm sure it'd be appealed, but it would be a national ruling.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, so it's a federal. It's well, I mean, if that gets in front of the Supreme Court, that's it's pretty likely that you're now getting the Supreme Court dramatically, right, ruling about medicine. At some point, I mean, I know there's been some fuss, but not enough from organized medicine, the AMA, the American Medical Colleges, the sort of the folks who hold the whole theory, the principle of the sacrosancy of medicine, but not enough. I do have one comment, which is I don't know if it ever got past law, but there was somebody was it Indiana or Idaho or both, where they were trying to make ectopic pregnancies that you would have to carry them to.
It was Ohio. It was Ohio.
Ohio. It was your law, was it?
And ironically, the legislator who proposed that used to work for me 20 years ago. And I did not realize how utterly dumb he is. I mean, he made no effort to talk to a doctor. Well, that's not even possible.
Well, my line on this one is always that my dad, who was an OBGYN, right, his single greatest, I don't know if I've told the story on the game before, but I'll tell it again. Mm-hmm. His single greatest achievement day in medicine, which he came and talked to us about, was he operated on a woman who gave a C-section to a woman who had somehow, and he didn't, I guess this is 1975 or something, so they hadn't really, in the 70s, they hadn't quite got as sophisticated in terms of scanning as they had now. And he somehow, he had a C-section lined up because there was something weird about her pregnancy. She was having slight stomach pains or something. Whatever reason, he lined up a C-section for her and did the C-section. It was an ectopic pregnancy. He couldn't find the uterus. The woman went through, I think, 12 pints of blood, all the pints of blood there were in the hospital. And, and the woman and the baby survived, right? And he got them out alive, which is, A, it's a miracle she got there, and B, it's an even bigger miracle that he got her, that she survived the surgery, and both she and the baby survived. And so I said, this is fine. Clearly ectopic pregnancies are okay to be carried to term, so long as my dad is available to do the C-section. He's been dead for 3 years, so maybe a bit tricky, but that was my theory. Anyway.
So last summer, a physician named Matthew Holt wrote a piece in, I think it was JAMA, about professional civil disobedience. And he was saying, it's time for physicians to band together and say, if you want to say that we can't do this stuff, well, who else are you going to do? Are you going to put us all in jail? And I'm worried that unless you see a massive collection acted, like from the people that are doing this stuff, I don't know what's going to stop these legislators from getting crazier and crazier.
But are there enough independent physicians to have that power now? I mean, so many work for big hospital systems, and are they going to go, are these big hospital systems going to go to bat for them?
Well, I think it's the paradox here. Actually, Jen, you asked a good question, right? Like, is it the independent physicians? It's actually more than 50% of physicians are employed now. And increasingly physicians, I'll be 53 this year. So I'm sort of that generation. I mark that generation from when physicians were independent now to being more employed. Like, so many young physicians now are getting ready to get a job. And I think that as physicians move to a more employed environment, you're seeing much more interest in physicians organizing, collective bargaining, that kind of thing. And you might I've always felt like independent physician practice really made it difficult for physicians to unite around anything, right? And I made that point in my med school application, my residency application. I was like, doctors don't care because they're largely independent. But in a world where most doctors are, essentially just the hired hands at a health system, I think you might start to see doctors thinking about themselves as labor rather than as owners, as they used to in the old days.
But in theory, the medical societies are the guild of physicians, and the guild is supposed to protect its people from other people doing what they should be doing. And I would argue that the legislators are doing exactly that. And if physicians aren't going to stand up for it, I don't know who is.
Sure. No, it's a great question. I think the guilds are good at preventing nurse practitioners from doing doctors' work. But other than that,
that's unfortunate too.
Other than that, I don't know if the guilds do a very good job in standing up against corporate interests or political interests.
You're exactly right, unfortunately.
And both of those happening, right? Because the other thing that's going on here is the purchase of many physician groups by private equity companies. Going back to your world, Stephen, there's a lot going on there in terms of and a big question as to what the actual end goal of those organizations is. But there's lots of criticisms, obviously, around things like the surprise billing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm, I hope that something comes up to this, but I think we're just going to have a messy situation for some time going forward on this, where maybe it's I don't know what exactly did Newsom take away from Walgreens. Did he ban them from filling strips of Medicaid or something, Medi-Cal or something? I don't know.
I think it was a contract to provide medication to inmates in the correctional system, which that's a whole other topic in of itself. If California has a $54 million contract to provide medication to inmates, do you think we have a few too many people in prison? But that's the contract that he was able to withdraw immediately.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So funnily enough, while we're talking about podcasts, Grace Moen, who used to work at Health 2.0 and is now I think doing a degree in PhD. I think she's doing a PhD in journalism or writing at Harvard. Has actually started the podcast, which I will dig up the name for, on prison healthcare, which has been, and at one point the California state prison system was under a federal czar because it was such a bad system for we have problems. We probably don't have enough time to discuss criminal justice issues in prisons here, but all good, all bad. Before we leave this, Stephen, you've been very quiet about this topic. I know it's not your sweet spot, and you probably don't run your mouth as much as the rest of us. But is this a topic that's come across your?
Well, I guess that the lens I would use is that in general, I think we are seeing a divergence across states on all sorts of issues. It'll be interesting to see what happens with telehealth, state medical boards and telehealth, as the state of emergency regarding COVID expires in those states. And then state medical boards have often actually been somewhat negative on telehealth. They want its use restricted. And that was all overwhelmed by the needs of COVID. And then if COVID is no longer a federal emergency or a state emergency, then those state boards, which tend to be dominated by prosperous physicians who would like people to come to their office, and they're not dominated by a part-time mom physician who's doing telehealth in half time or something. They tend to be dominated by very prosperous physicians who have big offices on Main Street, and they may want to bring back those restrictions. And so we'll see states where telehealth is has wide usage and equivalent reimbursement to in-person visits, and states where it's going to be restricted, even though people a year ago would not have thought that we would see telehealth restricted again. And that's analogous to some of the other differences that you guys are pointing out. Matt, you mentioned private equity. I would say that venture capitalists and private equity have raised enormous amounts of money, and they've been sort of sitting on the sidelines right now. And the expressions I've heard is, first, there's what's being called regime change. So regime change means we used to be in a low interest rate, low inflation, risk on environment, and now we're in a high interest rate, high inflation, risk off environment. That's a big difference. And investors, the next term I hear used is finding the bottom, which means investors think that rates will go up to fight inflation. That will cause valuations to come down, and they don't want to price or buy things until they think that the market has found the bottom. And so we're waiting for that as the Fed continues to raise rates, may raise rates again in March by 0.25 points or so. And then we may see those private equity funds, with all this dry powder they raised over the last 2-3 years, swoop in and buy more healthcare services companies, more clinic chains at a discount because valuations are down. So
yeah, it's interesting the price that they've been paying so far. We can sort of meander on over to that general topic of the sort of world you live in, but the price that have been paid so far for some of the more for some of the bigger chains, they're not as, I mean, for obviously take the biggest deal, which is Oak Street for CVS. You know, it's a pretty substantial price per patient, pretty substantial price overall. Obviously, you know, it's a loss-making organization, as was One Medical, which got bought by, for not quite such a high price, but still decent price by Amazon. You're seeing those transactions go on, but if you look at the across the board of the private equity backed, the public companies, I assume the private market is now reflecting this. You know, things are pretty grim. You can look at Bright Health, which seems to be going out of business. It's got a physician chain under it. Kano's stock is way, you know, Kano, his stock is way down. And you can imagine that sort of we will get a correction in the price of some of the, certainly not sort of the grade B rather than the grade A, you know, groups. Having said that, I'm still, you know, I'm in touch with a bunch of doctors, and some of the ones who've been bought out by private equity, maybe, you know, a couple of years back rather than now, done fine. There's still been some pretty decent amounts laid out there. So where do you think we are? Maybe this is the whole group, especially perhaps you, Jen. Where do you think we are in this sort of notional, we've overshot the interest rate increase, we're going to kill inflation, but there'll be a big recession and the world will fall apart? Because I've seen a bunch of random indicators. So for example, the cost of shipping is now below where it was before the pandemic, right? So it went up completely crazy in the pandemic, and there were millions and millions of containers sitting on boats outside Los Angeles, you know, on the coast of California that couldn't get in. The price of shipping was crazy, and now it's back to normal, you know, below normal. Seems to be the price of housing in some places seems to be correcting, coming down, you know, from the craziness that happened in the pandemic. So wages still seem, well, Jen, you tell me about wages and how people are, you know, how employment is. But we're seeing a lot of layoffs in the tech business, but overall it still looks pretty rosy.
Yeah, I mean, I think people look a lot at the layoffs in tech as an indicator of the whole economy, but a lot of those people who are getting laid off in tech, they're just immediately finding jobs in other sectors. And I saw some stats come through my inbox a few weeks ago that something like 80% of the people who were laid off before the holidays who were seeking another job have found one. So it was like some really high statistics in terms of people being able to shuffle into new jobs pretty quickly. You know, that said, there have been a lot of articles about the challenges of H-1B visa holders who are really, really in a tough situation when they're laid off, and, you know, kind of the scramble to get jobs. So, you know, the data is all over the place, but it still feels like the job market is really, really strong in some areas and then maybe changing in others. But it certainly doesn't seem, you know, it doesn't feel like a really grim outlook overall.
Well, I think I read that despite all the tech layoffs, employment is actually higher than it was before the pandemic. The thing is, they staffed up during the pandemic, and now they're getting down to where they were before.
A lot a lot of those big companies, they still have higher people, they still have more headcount than they did in the beginning of 2020. You know, a lot of them, it was just this insane hiring that happened in 2020, the end of 2020 and 2021.
And Matthew, I mean, remember, we just had like a once in a lifetime mega geopolitical event, right? In the
we hope it's one in a lifetime.
Well,
we're discussing how long we'll have to live, but
we'll say the first in our lifetimes. Let's put it that way, right? And again, I mean, like, you know, we saw supply chains being, you know, what is it called, the bullwhip effect with supply chains, and I mean, I think there's just, we're looking at all these different indicators and saying like, hey, how do we make sense of these things as if we're evaluating them from a pre-pandemic lens, right? But I think the world has changed. I think the world has changed in ways that economists are only, you know, in the future going to be able to say we are fundamentally changed in this way. And I think we're going to continue to see these different indicators that we have to interpret differently. And, you know, again, like I think the example has been, you know, we've been pushing up interest rates. This is not my area of expertise, but I've read about this. We've been pushing up interest rates. Normally, if you drive up interest rates that much in that short period of time, you should go into a recession, but that hasn't happened, right? So I think the world is different, and we have yet to figure out what this new equilibrium is going to be post-pandemic.
So Steven, obviously you're going to tell us what that is, but can you, finding the bottom and buying at the bottom, what was the expression you used? Sorry, you brought up earlier.
So for valuation, private equity and venture capitalists are waiting for us to find the bottom. In other words, the Fed may raise rates in March. That'll cause growth stocks to pull in further, public growth stocks, and then private growth company valuations will also pull in. And if they feel like the Fed is done raising rates, then we will have found the bottom. Or if the Fed announces, you know, we think we've tamed inflation and we don't think we're going to be raising rates anymore, then you'll know that was the moment of the bottom, and then investors will be happy to jump in. Now, investors would say they think that that growth stocks that we're talking about, like the NASDAQ here, could pull in 30% further from where they are. I'll also mention, so Matt, at the beginning of the call, you mentioned Silicon Valley Bank. They're down 60%. 60. So wow, that's one of the most remarkable things pieces of news I've seen in this world of tech and growth and digital health. And then also most Wall Street leading economists of like Fidelity or the major investment banks, they see us at the end of an expansion period, a slowdown at the end of an expansion and the beginning of a contraction period. And that's been mediated by the fact that we've had a lot of stimulus, a lot of monetary expansion and fiscal stimulus helping us out. Hopefully that will be a relatively short period of contraction, and then we'll be into the next kind of growth cycle. But I think people are worried that we might see interest rates go up, and then we might hit that contractionary period and see excessively high unemployment or other issues during that period. So we're at this intriguing stage where most Wall Street economists are saying that we're at the end of the expansion period and could go into an expected cyclical downturn that hopefully won't last long.
I mean, Kim, sorry.
So I read something contrary to conventional wisdom about the pandemic. So you remember the great chip shortage for cars and all these cars in the parking lot. So it turns out, everyone blamed, the chip manufacturers weren't making as many chips. They couldn't run their factories. They couldn't get them to supply chains. In fact, that's completely false. Chip manufacturing was up during the pandemic. The problem was the car manufacturers canceled their orders. And so the chips went other places. They went to computers, they went to phones, other consumer goods people are using. And then the car manufacturers were at the tail end trying to get chips, but they did it to themselves, trying to be proactive about it. So all of our conventional wisdom about what happened with all that thing was wrong.
That's interesting. I mean, I guess the other thing about, and you could argue that we have a bunch of different sort of supply issues that are still impacting us, right? So one is supply chain. I mentioned the ships, you mentioned the chips, and maybe there wasn't a problem with getting them here or whatever, but that was the story we were fed, if it's right or wrong. But certainly it ended up being there was a supply chain issue eventually, because there were cars in parked around now. The price of cars went up crazily. Now they're coming down again. Same thing with housing, right? We have a massive supply crisis in housing. So even if interest rates are going up, we saw a lot of money go into housing from private equity funds and God knows else and you can just walk around there was a great article, it was an Axios or one of the, I read anyway, I forget who wrote it, but it was basically saying that the problem with homelessness is lack of housing, which sounds very obvious, but it wasn't these other things. And they basically went through the places in America that have high rent versus low rent. And it's all supply constrained places like San Francisco and New York. And, even Idaho now apparently has got a lot of homelessness because so many people from California moved to Idaho, they're talking about the price of housing and now there isn't that much more supply. Whereas in the South, apparently in Florida and Atlanta places, there's much lower homelessness because housing is cheaper, right? And then the same thing is true. And I haven't looked at this, Jen. Maybe you have a bit more about the employment. Okay, we're talking about work. Headcount being very back to, but still decently high at many of these companies. But the overall participation in the labor force suddenly went down dramatically during the pandemic and didn't pick up and was going down anyway, right? So it's much lower than it has been. So maybe these are weird supply constraints that are holding up the economy. And we're not a panel of august economists, so we probably shouldn't stop talking about this. But it does have a big impact effect, right? In the how do you get venture capital and what's that going to do to the digital health market? So, Steven, what's your sort of take? Obviously, we all have an idea, but what's your take about sort of the state of play in fundraising? We've had a lot of, obviously, we haven't seen those incredible deals that we saw in the last couple of years where these new digital health companies, some of them were raising $100 million rounds every week, it seemed to be. But we still are seeing some money going out. So what's your fear about the state of play, sort of up and down for early stage companies versus later and the ones that are already public?
So digital health venture funds have raised enormous amounts of money, and largely they are sitting on the sidelines, not investing. So this is a phenomenon I hear from my clients and saying lead investors aren't leading. So we've been stuck in this for 5 quarters of lead investors aren't leading. And if you break it down by stage, when it comes to like Series C and later, we are seeing a reduction of about 95% volume in deals.
I guess you're right, but for you to say 95%, that's like it stopped, right?
Yeah,
it was crazy, but now it stopped.
And that's because the IPO window is closed, and oftentimes these deals are timed with a sense of 1.5 or 2 years until either an IPO or alternately a round before an IPO. And so then when you get to Series A and B, here volume is down about 60% as compared. This is all compared to year 2021, which was the banner year. And then when you get to angel and seed, there deals are going at like 90% of banner year volume, so only down about 10%. And no one's quite sure why things are looking so good there, but it tends to be you got smaller pools of money, different kinds of people investing it, and they're thinking 7 years in the future, and they're not all that concerned about whether the IPO window is closed or something like that. So that's the first issue. The second is valuation.
Can I ask you one? Well, sorry, you're about to answer my question, so keep going.
So that valuation levels. Here I'm going to use some metrics that have come from David Sachs at Craft Ventures, and he's using a multiple metric, which is for SaaS companies, and a lot of digital health software companies are SaaS companies. But at the height of the boom, and he's using general fast-growing tech, not digital health. But at the height of the boom, you were seeing fast-growing digital health or fast-growing tech companies trade at 17 times forward revenue. And some of us have seen numbers like that for digital health companies. And then at the bottom of the bust of valuations, median valuations had gone down to on the order of 4 to 5 times forward revenue. So just imagine that kind of collapse in valuations. And so now we're seeing it at about 7 to 8 times. There's been a rebound since the bottom of the bust in prices. And so these are interesting numbers to reflect on and this is enterprise value to forward revenue for a SaaS company that's growing fast. This kind of gyrations, this has led to an overhang problem. And the overhang problem is that digital health companies, they often have some cash on their books. but they're always in the market to raise money. And then there's going to be disagreement, problems, and issues between the CEO and the investors and the board about what exactly to do in this situation. So the classic thing is that a VC who's on the board might say, make the money you have right now last 2 years, which is hard, challenging. Certainly, the CEOs should have been doing belt tightening, but nevertheless, it's going to be a challenge to make it last for 2 years. And their competitors in a market with, say, 6 well-funded competitors may not have the same instructions, and so then they may outspend them for growth. CEOs are very conscious about losing that battle with their direct competitors. And so, but that VC may be saying that. They may be saying make it last 2 years because they don't want a paper down. They don't want their prior high valuation written down, because that makes it hard for them in their career to raise their next fund. But the CEO may be very happy to bite the bullet to get some money to win in the market, in order to win in the marketplace. And the CEO is probably going to get topped up. CEO and management is going to get topped up on their stock options at the new lower down round valuation. So it's opening up some conflict of interest among board members and management. And then this can be hairy to work out. And then you might have an investor who wants to come in and invest, and they I want these people to get their own minds straight before they talk to me, because I don't want to be painted as the bad guy coming in with the lower valuation, and I don't want to have to twist everyone's arm, around the table to get them to take my money or whatever. So this is an overhang issue that a lot of companies face, and it's been 5 quarters of this down round situation. People are beginning to run out of money, and then the issue becomes a lot more acute when that happens. And then it turns out that investors are waiting for the Fed to signal it stopped raising rates, for valuations to find the bottom before they jump in. But they have the money. They have the money. They're just waiting. So,
hey Steve, I have a question for you. You talked about the lack of willingness to invest being tied to a cold IPO market, but obviously IPOs are one way for companies to exit. A much more likely way for people to exit is through an acquisition, right? And the feeling that I have is like when I was at Blueprint and was running the accelerator there in 2016, there were not a lot of companies upstream of our startups that were acquiring them. The world is totally different now, 7 or 8 years later, right? You have Amazon acquiring One Medical, right? You have CVS acquiring Oak Street, right? In very significant billion-dollar deals. So do investors see that? Do the investors see that there's a much more robust acquisition market, or are they still very much tied to the public market?
So the market for consolidators, for trade sales, is better than 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's still not great. It's not as efficient and as sort of rich in both buyers and sellers as say enterprise SaaS markets, or consumer tech or gaming tech or something like that. So one of the issues, and I used to be a sell-side analyst on Wall Street covering digital health for investors, and we would always sit up there and optimistically say that next year the consolidation market's going to be bigger than last year, and it kept staying at disappointingly small, and then 2021 was actually a banner year for consolidations. Then 2022 was back down in trend, and 2023 looks like it'll be down in trend. So what's going on here? Well, I think one of the issues was that we sort of had the best time ever in the history of the world, maybe never to be repeated for digital health, after the global financial crisis. So after the global financial crisis, the Fed lowered rates, and you had there's this funny term called a zero interest rate phenomenon, which there's all these funny things that sort of exist, like people are joking that Zoomers making day in the life videos at work where all they do is eat snacks all day. That was a zero interest rate phenomenon. But there were, and maybe a zero interest rate phenomenon was the entry of 1,500, product-based digital health companies into the marketplace, with products, some of them, not all, but some of them had products that had squishy revenue models where they clearly did good, but they were just having trouble proving to a hospital they were better than what the hospital was doing, or they fit the hospital's fee-for-service business model better or something like that. And so you had this massive entry into the market. And then some of these digital health companies became the highest valued companies on earth. So for a while, Castlight was literally the highest valued company on earth. For a while, Medidata was among the highest valued companies on earth. For a while, Viva was among the highest valued companies on earth. These incredibly highly valued companies. And so you had the GEs, the IBMs, the Oracles of the world were just sort of sitting back and just waiting to see what happened. They didn't necessarily want to jump in and buy. When Teladoc bought, they seemed to want to buy not the leader, but the second or third best at a discount price. They seemed to be very conscious of and they violated that with Livongo, but before Livongo, they were looking to, and they had a mindset of like, we have the best sales force, so whoever we buy, we're going to make the king, and so we don't have to buy the most expensive company or whatever. Why was consolidation so weak in digital health compared to other sectors like enterprise B2B? And the answer was probably because the companies had such a high valuation as compared to revenue or earnings. And so now we actually have finally, people have been waiting a long time. Those valuations have pulled in. And so we may start to see that consolidation happen. Now here's the problem, is that there's two kinds of consolidators. There's mid-tier and there's large consolidators. And a mid-tier is like a Teladoc, which may be nearly earnings negative itself. It may be earnings positive, but not by much and not for long. Maybe for 2 years it's been earning positive or something or whatever. And then almost all these young small companies are earnings negative. And so for Teladoc, they don't have this is not Teladoc specifically. This is like companies like Teladoc. They're tech companies themselves that grew big and could now be acquirers. So for that category, they usually don't have a big cash balance. So if they're going to acquire a company, they have to raise money from investors. That's an extra permission level they have to go through. And then they're usually close to earnings break even themselves, either below earnings break even, or they've only been above earnings break even for a while. Now, in that environment, if they're going to buy a smaller company that's very earnings negative, that's not going to happen in today's environment. It's going to be very, very tough. They have to get another party's permission. Those investors are not going to want to see that the market's not going to react favorably to a Teladoc buying an earnings negative company and going more earnings negative in this environment. And investors whose permission is needed are not going to want to jump into that deal to make Teladoc more earnings negative or whatever. So that's the mid-tier in general. Then there's the big tier. The big tier is like the Amazon, Oracle. They have a big pile of cash. They're, $1 billion is a small number to them. They have a big pile of cash. And so for them, prices just came down. This is a great time, but up to now, they've been temperamentally conservative. If you're one of these young company leaders, you want irrational buyers flooding the market, drunk, it's very, very excited, happy to believing, the story about the future, happy to pay and overpay. But the big tier buyers who have cash on their books have been buying. They tend to have been, very temperamentally conservative over time. I expect them to continue to be temperamentally conservative. So we may see that volume pick up now that overall fast-growing young company valuations have come down to the level that the big consolidators will be more likely to buy them, but they're going to remain even tempered. And then the mid-tier consolidators are not well positioned to make a lot of acquisitions or drive prices up because of the reasons I mentioned.
So we need more irrational exuberance. I remember you were talking about the conflict of interest thing. I remembered Jeff Tagney was on the Health to Grow stage a while back. Early days of Doximity, they went IPO and did pretty well. And they were one of the few companies which is profitable. Which when they went IPO, I said, you're a disgrace to Silicon Valley. he wrote back, don't let the word get out, but they're actually profitable. But he said when Hippocrates was going, and I think it was before it IPO'd or maybe after, I don't know, somewhere in the mess that it was before the IPO, they apparently had to have a board committee to decide what the interest of the board was. because there were so many people on the board and off the board with so many different preference shares that no one could figure out what, who was going to do well out of what particular deal if they raised more money. And, the current investors got squished because there was they raised money so many times at so many different, so many different valuations and so many different, levels of preferences and paying back people for their capital, all that kind of stuff that, goes on in these bad times. And I think we'll have a lot of wash out of that. It's very much, it's the Warren Buffett thing. When the water goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And I think the water is going out at the moment and will continue to go out for a while. Yeah.
And Matthew, I would point out 2 of the Hippocrates founders have done really well. Tagny, is worth something like $1 billion on the if you look at the S1, and Tom Lee has done very well with that sale of One Medical. So
absolutely, and Galileo was raising money at a decent clip the other day. Although I did see a note that Carbon was raising money, and there was a note that I saw him that the investment from CBS, which happened also in the Carbon, so they bought Oak Street, they also put like 100 million into Carbon, was done at about 1/3 of the valuation of the previous. Now what the valuation really was in the previous round, who knows? Because all the preferences and written down and what's reality, you don't know. But certainly if you look at those publicly traded medical groups, they were off in some cases very heavily from the highs, and 80-90% down, and I think in some cases more. Looks like some of them, like Babylon and Bright, are going to be biting the carpet or whatever. I don't know what the expression is, right? But the many of them are way off, and so seeing something that's 2/3 off its high is probably not unrealistic for something that's a technology-based medical group. Especially when what just blows my mind is how much money the organizations keep on losing, right? And they all have these different sort of things called like adjusted EBIT, and EBIT if we weren't trying, and EBIT if we weren't expanding, and EBIT if we were profitable in the first place, and all these other measures that are like bullshit. But your actual cash flow, they were all in trouble. And I think One Medical hadn't had that deal with Amazon might actually go back and raise more money in the public markets, which obviously, as you've mentioned, Steven, would have been extremely tricky, which seems to blow my mind because everyone else in healthcare, I know life is a bit tough and some of the hospitals aren't doing as well. But if you look at the Optums of the world and many of these pre-backed companies, they seem to be making plenty of cash. So I don't know. Anyway.
The world of pharma spending money on pharma tech software, that's going really great. The pharma has a lot of money to spend on pharma tech. The world of hospitals, health IT, hospitals spending on hospital tech, that is not going great. That hospitals feel poor. They may have money to spend on revenue cycle management. They probably have overinvested in EMR in the past and continue to be reluctant. And there may never have been a good financial return on EMRs, and they're cautious on that. And then payers are very profitable, but they're not taking this moment to spend that money on tech, unfortunately, for those of us who live in the world of software companies selling into these areas. So payers have managed to be profitable like pharma, but not spend their money on tech for reinvention like pharma is. So yeah,
it seems to me that the payers, the obvious one that's a bit of a weird exception is Optum, which is which is a tech company hidden inside a big payer, right? But they also are spending most of their money on provider organizations, right? They've been expanding rapidly in that arena. They have bought a lot of small tech companies, but they've done a lot of invention, not invented here stuff, invention at home as well.
They've described themselves for decades as a healthcare company that also does insurance. They've never described, since the 1990s, they haven't described themselves as a payer at all.
Well, that is true what they've described themselves as, because there's a lot of problems if you're the biggest payer, biggest health plan, and you also happen to own, for instance, the database that tells doctors how much they get paid and that kind of stuff. I remember there's been issues with Optum, and back in the days when it was called, what was it called?
United? Yeah.
I've already forgotten the name. When Andy Slavitt ran it, it was called something. It was called Ingenix.
Yeah.
That's right, and they owned a bunch of random stuff as well. And they had to change their name and this and the other. But quietly they've become the biggest physician owner in the country, right? So, well, not that quietly, but it's not people.
But correct me if I'm wrong.
Politically and big picture wise, they're associated as being United. They're still United Healthcare, right? They're still the biggest.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. They're not buying primary care practices, right? They're buying specialty, like.
I mean, they bought a lot of multi-specialty groups as well.
Yeah.
They have, but I think, they haven't gone out and aggressive, although they bought Kelsey Searboard in Houston, which was a very big Medicare Advantage practice. They haven't aggressively gone out and bought those sort of primary care based groups that are in the new world, the ways at Oak Street or Iora or whatever it is. And we'll see. But although we'll see. I await Amazon and One Medical spitting out Iora and United buying it, but who knows? We'll see what happens there. All right. So there was one other topic raised. I know we have a couple of minutes left. There was one other topic raised at the start I've now forgotten about. That was going to be that I have committed. It was the one you raised, JL, that was not the one about
DEA.
It's not. What was the one you raised that wasn't the DEA? Or am I now?
I raised the topic of AI and 60% of people not being comfortable with a physician relying on AI.
Well, I mean, we ended up talking about AI. I think it was last week. It was the week before, which
last week.
To me, so I guess the question is: in the last 2 weeks, has there been enough progress on AI that we can report back on it? I went to an investor dinner actually about last week, and there was a lot of discussion about how this is changing. I tried to get ChatGPT to write 2 things in the last week. One was I wanted to write a bunch of questions for interviews. I'm helping a company with HR at the moment. And it was pretty bad at doing that. But then I asked it to write a job description for what I was actually doing at the company so I could fire myself. And it was almost perfect. I get it. So, there's a lot of power in there. And there's a lot of discussion, of course, about, how this is actually going to get used and people trying to figure out, can you bring it to be part of a legal software or whatever. So it's fascinating.
It all changes so fast, though. I mean, if you asked people 10 years ago if they'd be comfortable talking to their doctor in an app or, via video on their phone, half of them wouldn't even have known what you were talking about. Yeah.
And I think Rock Health said 80% of people who used telehealth and 87, someone I just saw a poll in who reported it, 87% of doctors have now used telehealth. And I still remember, 2013, 2014, the Health 2.0 stage, many of you were probably there. Waving from the stage. I'd just done an Amwell visit for my then. So it must be. I think my kid had a rash on his ass, and he must have been 2. So 2015, 2016, and still hot. Most of the crowd there had never had a telehealth visit, even though it was Health 2.0. I remember seeing Jason Gorovich from Teladoc at a Wall Street Journal Health conference in 2018, 2019. And they polled the audience. Only a third of them had ever had a telehealth conference. Of that audience, an audience that cared about digital health. So it's remarkable how, that's now that now has changed. Even if the people who gained the most out of it weren't actually Teladoc and Doctor on Demand, those other guys. But anyway.
Jen, there's a great joke on that topic, which is that 20 years ago people said, don't talk to strangers and don't get in a car with a stranger. And today, and don't talk to, anonymous people on the internet. And today you use the internet to summon a car to get into,
Yeah. Well, I met my husband on a dating app. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, I met him first. I should have warned him off.
I know you did.
Jen is I'm the weird person who knew both Jen and her husband independently before they met each other, which is very strange.
And you didn't
I met him, but I met him in a bar the old-fashioned way, and I met you at a conference the old-fashioned way. So I'm sorry. All right. Okay, we're at the end of our hour. We're just going to quickly go around and see what people are looking at next. Stephen, I want to thank you a lot for the lowdown on the latest in the world of investing, and we're out there. I think when I used to be stock trading, it was like picking the bottom instead of catching.
I love it. So in the financial community, it's we're finding the bottom basically.
I think it's bottom picking and catching falling knife catching. That's my stock trading usually. But let's quickly go around and see what else people are thinking of in the next couple of weeks that we'll look at. I will start with you, Kim.
Well, everyone was so excited when the surprise billing legislation finally passed. One of these things that everybody agrees on, everybody's outraged by it. Well, I saw today that the Biden administration has had to suspend the arbitration process because it has been flooded with so many appeals by providers about the process, about the things they think it favors the insurer. So Even on something on healthcare that everybody agrees is a terrible thing, we can't even get that legislation to work right. It's just despairing.
Mhm.
Hard to imagine that, you know, providers would be complaining about the fact that the surprise billing thing was ruled against them. Yeah. JL.
FTC, as you know, has been cracking down on digital health companies like BetterHelp, GoodRx. That seems like that's an ongoing thing. There's some big fines, like $7-10 million fines there. So I'm interested to see, you know, who gets pulled into this. And again, the idea that these companies, even though they said in their terms and conditions that they weren't sharing your data, were actually sharing your data is really bad.
I think I'm in the middle of this one because I think those companies were sharing their data with themselves. They were using it so they could track their own customers on the platforms they were, which happened to be Facebook. But,
for sure, but
and many of them saying it was what everyone in the consumer world did on Facebook and still do.
Right, but the idea that your information could bleed into the metaverse to be used and manipulated by Mark Zuckerberg is very troubling, right?
Of course, even though I bought a bunk bed the other day for my place in Tahoe, and I've been festooned with bunk bed adverts ever since. So somebody knew it. Right? Steven, what are you looking at in the next couple of weeks, other than the most amazing podcast in the history of the world, which will be happening with me in a week's time?
Well, thank you. So I talked to a lot of very legitimately thought-leading VCs, and one of them I will call in this category is also Lisa Sunin, who's probably well known on this show as well. And they have been remarking on how, you know, we have so much time and effort invested in building great software to sell the software to providers and payers. And then it turns out that providers and payers are terrible buyers, and providers on top of that are also poor business managers. A physician is often a poor manager of a small business. And so the thesis of Lisa Sunin and others, I think it may also be Oak's thesis as well, is that we need technologists to come in and run care, not sell software licenses and subscriptions, but to run care. And so this is the story of One Medical and Oak Street and others. And so I think that in the next generation, we're going to see more and more of that. And one of the phrases for it is alternate care delivery models. Do you provide mental health for young women? Maybe it should be virtual first, because maybe they're expecting to look to their phone for their care, for example. And that's going to be led by technologists wearing turtlenecks, and the poor doctors with their white coats, you know, are going to find that their lunch has been eaten in the hospital cafeteria by these people. So,
well,
and just to jump in on that, I would say doctors are best as employees, and I hate to say it, but startups that view doctors as business partners, as customers, are startups that often do not succeed. So I definitely agree. We're moving in the direction of providers of all sorts, not just physicians, being really part of organizations that are created de novo to solve a problem.
Jen, let's end with you.
Well, something I've been really keen in on the last several days, it's a little bit off topic, but the Biden administration is potentially thinking about detaining families at the border again, asylum seekers, which is an absurd policy. It's just so bad on so many levels. We're traumatizing a whole future generation of workers that the US needs, and not to mention just the general human rights violations and so forth. So I've been keeping an eye on that, and I have all of the browser windows open to be sending off some notes to all of the politicians who in theory should have their eye on this too. But I think it's something important for us to keep an eye on. It's a public health crisis. It's another public health crisis in my mind.
I mean, it's part of the general sort of lack of understanding of how the flow of things actually work. And then we've just had this New York Times series where they looked at immigrant children working in like factories and slaughterhouses and God knows what. And, you know, we're at the end. If we talk about, you know, the end of as Stephen was mentioning, we're at the end of a cycle of no interest rates and crazy stuff. Like we're at the end of a cycle of no regulation, right, which has been going on for many years. And I think part of Biden's going to bring back America, bring back union jobs, bring back, you know, it's kind of can we go back to the FDR kind of, you know, regulating this stuff properly, and hopefully something will happen. But the border and immigration, I mean, is such a contentious issue, you know, in America, but also you know, in the north of the world as a whole, that I hope we get some sense out of it. But I remind you who runs the House of Representatives. It's not a pretty picture. Okay, and on that inspiring thought, I want to thank my audience, thank my guests. You've been listening to Kim Bellard from the solid Midwestern town of Cincinnati, John and Neptune from the crazy island of Manhattan, Jen Benz from the hellhole of San Francisco. Was it very nice? I can't quite tell. And Steve Wardell. Steve, you hang out in Boston, right? Still?
Yes.
Yes. The erudite, intellectual, academic college city of Boston. Not a great college town, as they said in Spinal Tap. And that's the end. You've been listening to THCB Gang. I am Matthew Holt, your host. Thanks for listening. We will be back in a week with another different gang. We'll be rounding up whatever happens in healthcare in the next week or so. For now, thanks for listening either live or seeing the video later or catching us on the podcast on Apple and Spotify. See you soon.